Hi, my name is Matthew Garrick. I'm the new Waterfowl program leader here in Nebraska, and today I'm going to be going over some of our staff recommendations for waterfowl season hunting dates. Just to provide a brief overview of what I'll be talking about here today, I'm going to start out by providing some information on our federal framework basics, or how we set up our waterfowl seasons, or what constrains us. And then I'm going to go over each of our hunting seasons here separately, and our staff recommendations for our season structure by zone. So when it comes to federal frameworks, what's important to realize is that the ultimate jurisdiction for waterfowl is with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service chooses to manage waterfowl in a flyway system. There's 4 flyways in the U.S., and here in Nebraska we are part of the Central Flyway. What I want to point out is that it's not always about what's best for Nebraska. Kind of what the impetus for the flyway system is, it's a compromise among those states and provinces in the flyway for when it comes to their hunting season regulations. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service really provides the sideboards for how we can set up our waterfowl season. So they leave it up to the states on what their season structure is going to look like, while providing the guidelines for what that is allowed to look like. So when it comes to Nebraska being the Central Flyway, we cannot start our duck season before the Saturday closest to September 24th, and we cannot go past January 31st. Currently, we are in a liberal harvest package which allows for 74 days of regular duck hunting. In total, we can't have more than 107 days for hunting ducks, and this comes or becomes important when we include our high plain extra days as well as our special September teal seasons. For dark geese, we can have 107 days total. We again can start the season on the Saturday nearest September 24th and can run it through the Sunday nearest February 15th. White-fronted geese, there's really kind of different options depending on what bag limit you elect to take. With a 3-bird bag limit, you can have a 74-day season. With a 2-bird bag limit, you can have an 88-day season. And with a 1-bird bag limit, you can have a 107-day season. So to provide a little more background information here, our duck and goose hunting zone changes were approved by the Commission last March in 2020. We then submitted them to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they are going through their approval process to publish them in the Federal Register, which is happening right now. So we're at a point where we cannot change our hunting zone boundaries, and we are just going through our final approval with the Commission for the purpose of our orders. The preference survey that you're going to see here was completed last fall, and then we used parts collection data to look at how, or estimate how, harvest would change with these different season dates or season date ranges that we're going to be talking about related to the preference survey. So we really, in each of our decisions for when we were going to start any hunting season, we were trying to compromise between maximizing harvest and the preference of hunters that partook in the preference survey. So I'll jump right in here to the early teal season. First, I'll just kind of point out that 30% of people said they didn't mind when the teal season opened. They would go out and try and utilize it whenever it was open. And kind of the options for when that we provided for on the survey for when the teal season could open was Labor Day weekend, which had about 16.3% of people select. The first weekend after Labor Day, which had 25.2% people select. And then September 1st to the 16th every year, which was the most popular choice with 28.2% of people selecting. So kind of to go through this, what we actually recommended was to open on Labor Day weekend, and how we kind of came up with that is that kind of one of the issues here with the teal season is that the high plains zone only gets is able to or is only able to utilize 9 days of the teal season because they run into that 107 total day framework with their high plains extra days. So because of this, we weren't very happy about having the teal season start on the first every year because the high plains would only get 9 days, so they would only have the first to the ninth. And if the first doesn't open on a Saturday, then they'll only get one weekend out of it. And we really wanted them to be able to have 2 weekends of the teal season. Kind of the issue with the first weekend after Labor Day is that in some years, like this year coming up, Labor Day is quite late, and so that the first Saturday after Labor Day wouldn't actually be till September 11th, which, based on our kind of harvest estimates for early teal season, that's kind of after a lot of the harvest has historically happened. And so we really want to put our hunters in a position to harvest the most bluewings as possible. So with the wrapping up teal season there, we're now gonna move on to our regular duck zone date preferences. So here's just a kind of a brief overview of what our new zone boundaries look like. There were some pretty significant changes. Kind of first being that our new duck zone 4 is the historic kind of zone 3 low plains area, and our old zone 4, or the rainwater basin area, is now part of zone 2. Those are pretty significant changes from our historical duck zones here in Nebraska. So as I go through each of these slides, they're all going to look the same in that on the left side here, we'll have a graph depicting the survey response from our hunter preference survey. And just to kind of explain these graphs here, the more negative a number is corresponds to the greater disliking for that date as a start date, whereas the higher it is, or the more positive it is, the greater satisfaction with that date as a starting date. Over on the right half of this PowerPoint, we have a table here looking at the estimated total harvest. And what this is estimating is how we expect harvest to change if we were to select the corresponding starting dates for season relative to our estimated harvest from last year. So we could, by looking at this graph on the left here, we can see that the highest preference is for a starting date of October 23rd. And it's pretty clear that people don't want to have season starting in September or that first weekend of October. So we can go over to the table here and see that October 23rd to January 5th, we estimate that our total duck harvest will decline about 14% compared to our harvest last year, which is largely due to a decrease in the number of other ducks harvested. So this is any other duck that's not a mallard, which is really corresponding to those earlier season migrating ducks like green-winged teal, widgeon, and gadwall. So while we take into consideration that people seem to be wanting for a later season date, start of October 23rd, when we look at the harvest, that's a pretty big decline in harvest. So while recognizing that people would like a later season, we pushed the season dates back a week from what they historically were when where last year they started about October 10th to starting out on the 16th. So this is kind of to, again, recognizing that people would like later season dates, but trying to minimize the effects that we'll likely see on harvest. So for duck zone 2, we have the same kind of setup here where we have the preference survey on the left and the estimated change in harvest on the right. Kind of the major change here in duck zone 2 is that historical zone 4, or the rainwater basin area, is now a part of that zone. So typically the season dates have started around the first or so of October. And so when we look at our preference survey here, you can see there's pretty fairly negative response in that people don't want to start the season in September. And there's even a negative response to starting the season on the historical start date. But there's not really any overwhelming positive support for any of those real later seasons, but it is more positive than our historical start date. So all these numbers are fairly neutral, but while also recognizing that there does seem to be a preference to have a slighter later date, when we compare that to how we expect harvest to change with those later dates, really harvest dramatically decreases each week you go past that historical start date. So you can see if we push back a week than we historically have had it to October 9th, we'll probably see a 14% decline in harvest, which is almost entirely attributed to other ducks. If we go back a week later than that, we'll see a 30% decline in total harvest, and with 40% of that being in other ducks. So as we push season back each week, we see a bigger and bigger decline in our other duck harvest. So with that in mind, we decided to recommend to push season back a week later than it historically has, because we've recognized that people appear to want later seasons, but we want to minimize the effect that will have on harvest. Moving on to duck zone 3 here, when we look at the preference survey, there's a pretty strong preference to have the duck season start about that third week in October there, about October 23rd, which is when it's historically started. One of the big issues, or I'd say one of the more challenging issues with this zone, is that it's kind of switched between opening on a Thursday and opening on a Saturday. And so we asked that question on this survey and found about 30% of people wanted it to start on a Saturday and 30% of people wanted it to start on a Thursday. So really this year we are recommending it start on a Saturday, and the way we kind of came up with that was that if we started on a Thursday, the people in this zone really like their high plains zone days to start immediately after their regular duck season and run as close as possible to the federal frameworks. And if we started on a Thursday before the 23rd, we would be the high plains days would be finishing about a week before the federal frameworks close, or the end of federal frameworks, or the January 31st, which is a bit earlier than typical for this zone. And if we go the Thursday after October 23rd, we end up losing some of those extra days, because they would theoretically go to February 2nd or so, which isn't possible. So we would effectively just be giving up those days because we have to close on the 31st. So with that in mind, we are recommending starting on October 23rd, which is a Saturday. Duck Zone 4, so this is kind of the historic low plains part of Zone 3, or the kind of the area along the Platte River. Again, these guys have a pretty clear disliking for those earlier season dates, in September and those first 2 weeks of October. They're a little more neutral about the 16th of October, but a pretty strong preference for the 23rd. So when we look at harvest here, we can see that overall harvest actually increases through kind of that historic 23rd of October, which is about when it's always started. But there is an effect on the other duck harvest, where the later we start, the lower number of those earlier migrating ducks like green-winged teal, pintails, widgeon, gadwall will be harvested. So that kind of wrapped up the duck zone preferences. From there, we'll kind of move on to our goose zone hunting day preferences. So we did see some pretty big changes in our goose zones, in that we combined quite a few different units because we had been selecting season dates that were the same, so there wasn't really a need to have as many units as we had. I would point out that the Niobrara unit actually has the same dates as the Platte River unit. We just weren't able to combine those into one zone because the zones have to be contiguous. So jumping in here to the north central dark goose unit, kind of historically this zone has started around the 3rd of October or so. But then when we look at our preference survey, there's definitely seems to be a preference toward later dates here, with the highest preference in the survey being a starting date of the 18th of October. But when we start to look at our estimated change in harvest with those dates, if you push back to the 18th of October, we're going to have about a 25% decline in harvest. So here's another zone where we recognize that people here would like to see the season start later, and with that in mind, but also trying to not detrimentally affect our harvest, we recommend pushing the season back a week from when it historically was to about October 11th. The Platte River Dark Goose unit, I'd say the important thing to realize here with our dark goose seasons is that we have our Platte River restrictions that go into effect on the 10th of February. So we're not wanting to run our goose season past that date. So we can see here by the survey that we have a strong preference for having the season start in the latter part of October there, and we have pretty strong disliking to having the season start in early October, which works out because by having the season start the end of October there, we can run it all the way to February 9th, which is just a day before those Platte River restrictions kick in, when we're not willing to have our dark goose season open for law enforcement purposes. And when we look at the harvest here, we can see that if we go earlier in the season, we'll see a decline in harvest. So it's really maximizes both preference and harvest. So it's pretty easy date to select. The Niobrara Dark Goose unit, we again have a pretty strong preference for starting the season later in October, which is where it's historically been. And so, yeah, we don't have a lot of harvest in this area, but again, it's pretty clear on when those dates should be, so they're a little more straightforward. And we recommended starting the date on October 28th and running to February 9th, just like the North Platte goose unit. When it comes to white-fronted geese, as I said kind of at the beginning of the presentation, there's different options for how long the season can run based on your bag limit. So we asked in this survey what bag limit and season length would people prefer, and 44% of people preferred the 88-day season with a 2-bird bag limit. I don't have any harvest data here because we really don't shoot a lot of white fronts in Nebraska, but generally the way harvest goes is harvest starts to pick up in mid and late October and into the first part of November, and then kind of declines thereafter. And then sometimes, depending on the weather that year, people are able to shoot some white fronts in kind of the last part of the season as they're pushing back north for their spring migration. So really we're trying to divide those 88 days to cover both of those periods, and there's a pretty strong preference to have the season start in kind of that second week of October, and then have a break there, and then open again for the last 2 weeks of kind of where we're willing to have the dark goose season to run up to that February 9th date. So yeah, we have pretty high preference there, and again, this was another one that I'm pretty confident in, that people will be pretty happy with those dates. When it comes to light geese, we try to overlap that season as much as possible with white fronts, so people have the opportunity to harvest white fronts and snow geese together. But snow geese have a longer federal framework. They have 107 days, so we start on the same date as we do with white fronts, so that October 9th day. And then we also want it to be open during the last 2 weeks, from the end of January to February 9th, when we have it open for white fronts as well. So we're just able to keep it the first part of that season open through January 5th, because we've got extra days compared to the white front season. When it comes to the conservation order, we have 3 zones, and there's kind of different federal frameworks for the number of days we can have in those zones, kind of based on whooping cranes migrating through the state. We really want to protect our hunters from not accidentally, or from accidentally shooting a whooping crane. So that's why the frameworks are a little bit shorter in the rainwater in the west zone, the rainwater basin zone in the west zone. So yeah, those seasons start up straight after all our regular hunting seasons finish. So with that, yeah, thanks for your time, and I hope this was informative. One thing I did mean to point out is, if you go to the Nebraska Game and Parks website and go to the waterfowl page, you can look under the waterfowl hunting season reports, and you can actually see all these reports on our preference survey and our harvest information, as well as the teal season preference survey. So with that, thank you for your time, and have a good one.